Hi, this is Brad Wewell, and I am today going to present the trial of Jesus Christ from a legal viewpoint. It's a really, really, really interesting story that is in all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, about Jesus' last hours on earth and how he ended up, frankly, on the cross, and what sort of legal machinations went on between the time he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane about midnight and he was dead by 3 o'clock the next afternoon. So this whole scenario took place in about 18 hours, maybe 15 hours. And so a lot happened in that period of time. Now, the presentation I'm going to give you, I did not write. It was written by Chief Justice Joe R. Greenhill, who was the Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court. I knew Judge Greenhill. He was a great, godly man. He presented this all over the state. I heard him give it probably in 2005 to a lunch of the Christian Legal Society here in Austin, and he has since passed away. I contacted his son, Joe Jr., who's an esteemed lawyer here in Austin. Joe sent me the presentation, said, go for it, Brad, and here we go. But I want to make sure I give Justice Greenhill full credit because I'm just going to regurgitate what he did, but in the regurgitation, there's a lot of stuff, and he did a lot of research, so let's get started. So Jesus was a very controversial figure around the time that he was crucified. He was a religious leader, he wasn't a military leader. Had he been a military leader, everybody would have probably gotten on board, yeah, let's go get the Romans who are ruling Israel at the time. Let's go throw them all out. Let's go kill them all. Let's take over. We're going to have our own little shtick here, our own little country back. Isn't that great? That wasn't him. He came as a religious leader and a religious figure, and he made people upset because the status quo really consisting of the what's called the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling group of the priests and the scribes and the elders in Israel at the time, didn't like it because it was challenging their belief system and frankly challenging their what they perceived their political system. And they wanted to do something about this guy and get him out because it was very popular. You might recall about a week before he was killed, he came down the hill from Mount Olives Palm Sunday, and everybody was so happy. And again, a week later, the guy's dead. Less than a week later, he's dead. That was Sunday. He was killed on Friday. So let's look at what happened here, and let's kind of pick this apart again from a legal standpoint and see where we're going to go. So there are two trials, two people that are going to try Jesus. Each one, the Hebrew trial in the front of the Grand Sanhedrin, Great Sanhedrin, excuse me, there were at least two trials there. The Romans, probably three trials. Let's talk about the Hebrew trials, and then we'll talk about the Roman trials. And I'm going to tell you, there is this tension. Was it the Hebrew court that really did him in? Was it the Roman court that really did him in? And the Hebrews had the ability to try people, but the Hebrews didn't have the ability to issue the death penalty. Only the Romans can do that. They used to have that ability. It was taken away from them. They had to go to the Romans, and the Romans did actually kill Jesus on the cross on Good Friday. So, Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is there with his disciples. He gets arrested, led by Judas, who was one of his 12 apostles, but he was a traitor. Jesus is taken first to the home of Ananias. And Ananias was the former high priest, but he was really the power behind the throne. He had been the high priest. He got removed by the Romans because he was killing people using the capital punishment. And they said, we're not going to let you do that anymore. He still did it. You're out. Didn't imprison the guy. Just said, you're not going to be the chief priest, the high priest anymore. You're going to be the former high priest. Well, everybody else recognized him as the high priest. So in the law, he would become the de facto high priest. We're going to hear of another high priest in a second, Caiaphas. He was the official high priest. He was Ananias' son-in-law, and he's the high priest de jure So nice little legal terms. Ananias is really in charge. Caiaphas has the title. They're both going to be involved in this thing. Let's see what Ananias does. So Ananias has Jesus come in, and he talks to him, and he tries to get him to admit to things. And it's interesting in Hebrew law that there were a lot of protections for a defendant. A lot of protections for the defendant. One, you had the right to testify on your own behalf. Two, you had the right to call witnesses. Three, you had to know the charges that you were being brought up on. And Jesus, when he was arrested, wasn't informed of the charges. He was brought in front of Ananias, really not informed of the charges. He ultimately did say, I am the Christ and the Son of God, and that's what took them apart and made them want to really, that was the final blow, because now it's blasphemy, and again, under their law, you could kill somebody for blasphemy. And so, but there was no formality to this. The Hebrew, the rule of the Sanhedrin said that any trial had to be in the daytime. And this is at night. Again, Jesus should have been allowed to have the charges against him read. He had the right to testify on his own behalf. He had the right to call witnesses. Really, none of that was provided for him. So he's tried before Ananias and found guilty of blasphemy. He's shipped over to Caiaphas because, again, we want to have a little more formality here. And in Caiaphas, we don't really have a written record of what happened, but the next thing we know, the Sanhedrin is brought together. All this, there's 71 members, scribes, religious leaders, and the elders, and they all decided that Jesus was guilty of blasphemy. But remember, it's nighttime, it's not daytime, so it's really not a valid hearing. They wait until morning. They get them all back together and say, yeah, sorry, that first trial really wasn't it. We're now going to find him guilty. It's daytime, so this is a little more legitimate. But it's interesting, again, back to the law they had. Because the law not only said, do you have to have a hearing, particularly with the death penalty, in the daytime, it said you have to have two hearings, 2 days apart. And the reason for the second hearing, this is very, very interesting, is to make sure this was a real thing. This wasn't mob justice. So you have one hearing on one day. If everybody votes for conviction, or excuse me, a majority votes for conviction, you have to have a trial the next day. And over that night, between the first trial and the second trial, the leaders of the Sanhedrin are supposed to talk about this, pray about this, make sure they got it right. Because maybe they didn't. It was a horrible thing to execute an innocent person under their law anyway, and they had to make sure they weren't doing that. The next day, they called the whole group together. This is how the law should have worked for Jesus too. They called the group together and say, okay, where are we at? If somebody in the first trial had voted for acquittal, they couldn't change their vote. But if somebody on the first day had voted to convict, they could change their vote. So it was interesting, and if you couldn't sit on the Sanhedrin as a juror in a capital case if you didn't have a son. Fascinating, isn't it? You had to be the father of a son, because the theory went, if you didn't have a son, you couldn't appreciate the fact that we're going to kill somebody else's son and render capital punishment on him. So none of those things really happened to Jesus. So the theory here is, and I think it's borne out by the facts, these were not proper convictions under the law of the Sanhedrin. They were really, again, kind of mob violence because they wanted this guy dead. I mean, you got too much going on, you're too popular, you're a threat to us politically, you're a threat to us because our religious views differ from yours. Frankly, you're a threat to us financially. Remember, Jesus went into the temple and overturned all the money changers and all that stuff, and that was a real direct affront at the leaders too. So they're all ready to go, but they can't kill Jesus under their law because the Romans won't let them. Now the Romans, these are big, bad dudes, of course. This is the Roman Empire, and in Israel at the time, the leader, as we all are familiar with the name, Pontius Pilate, was the guy. He was the governor. And they brought Jesus before Pontius Pilate and said, this guy is stirring up trouble. He's no good. You need to kill him for us. And Pontius Pilate, to his credit, said, well, slow down, Slick. What kind of charges are you bringing this guy? Well, he's stirring up trouble, and he said something about not paying taxes to Caesar, and he says he's the king. Well, Pontius Pilate couldn't care less about their religious differences with Jesus. He's a Roman. He worships the Roman gods. Now, the Romans were interesting. If they took over a country, they kind of let you keep your own religion. They kind of let you keep the basis of a civil legal system in place. As long as you didn't go against Roman law, have at it. Enjoy your life. It was called Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And so he's there. He'd had a few scrapes with the Sanhedrin already and had been disciplined by Rome for not being as fair, I guess would be the term, with the local residents of Israel at the time. And so he was a little nervous. He's also got a boss. His boss is Caesar Tiberius, who was very, very paranoid about somebody challenging his rule. And this is going to come up when ultimately Pilate turns Jesus over to be crucified because of Jesus' claim to be a king. So stand by, here we go. Jesus is brought before Pilate. Pilate talks to Jesus. You know, are you a king? Where are you from? And Jesus is very, I don't want to say vague, he's just a little mystical in his answers to Pilate. Pilate listens to him, is a little bit uncertain, and finally comes out and says, look, guys, I've talked to this guy. He's not guilty of anything worth the death penalty. I'm going to let him go. And the crowd that had gathered, because again, we are talking nothing less than mob violence, starts shouting, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate is in a place where he doesn't know what to do. And his wife comes to him. Pilate's wife comes to him and said, look, don't have anything to do with this guy, Jesus, because I had a dream last night. I suffered in a dream over this guy. Please don't have anything to do with him. So Pilate does something that I am guilty of on very rare occasions. He ignored his wife. What an idiot, right? Ignored his wife and should have followed her advice, as I should do sometimes too. But he ignored his wife's advice, and he's, look, honey, not today, I'm in charge. But he's looking for a way out, because he really doesn't want to kill Jesus, because he really knows he's not guilty of any deserving capital punishment. Who happens to be in town that same day in Jerusalem but a guy named Herod? Now, this is not the same Herod that baby Jesus and Mary and Joseph were afraid of, and the wise men came, and then he killed all the little babies around because he was trying to kill Jesus when Jesus is a baby, and the wise men said he was going to be the king, and Herod didn't like anybody challenging his authority too. This is not that same guy. This is that guy's son. And Herod was in Jerusalem, and Herod had powers with Pilate. I don't exactly know what their respective jurisdictions were, but Herod ruled Galilee, which is in the north of Israel. Pilate ruled Judea, which is in more southern Israel, and Jesus was from Galilee. So Pilate says, look, I got an idea. I'll send Jesus across down to Herod. I'll let Herod fool with this mess. So he does, sends Jesus to Herod. Herod's excited because he'd heard about Jesus. Hopefully, maybe he'll do a miracle for me. Doesn't say a word. Jesus says nothing to Herod, not a word to Herod. Herod puts on a very expensive robe on Jesus and ships him back to Pilate and says, look, I don't find anything wrong with him. He didn't say that in the it's not recorded that way in the Bible, but he did send him back and didn't kill him and didn't file any extra charges. So the implication was Herod found him not guilty, and Pilate says that. Pilate says, look, when Jesus shows back after seeing Herod, he said, look to the crowd, I didn't find anything wrong with this guy. Herod didn't find anything wrong with this guy. There's nothing wrong with this guy. So if you want to look at it again from a legal perspective, Pilate acquitted Jesus. Herod acquitted Jesus. Jesus comes back to Pilate, and he acquits him again. So we have 3 acquittals right there, and Jesus should have been let go. But the crowd was so intent that Jesus had to die. Pilate, he's struggling. He says, I got an idea. It's a great idea. at the Passover, this is around the Passover. In fact, the Passover was the next day. He says, look, my tradition is to free a prisoner who's been accused of some heinous stuff, and you tell me who you want. Why don't I let Jesus go based on that? He'll be the guy I let go because it's a Passover. He's the criminal. I'll free. Let's do it that way, and let's just kind of have a good day. Let's all go home and enjoy the Passover. And the crowd said, absolutely not. We are not letting you let Jesus go. We want a guy named Barabbas. And Barabbas was a bad dude. I don't know what he was guilty of. I think there's a few references about, well, maybe a murderer, robber, whatever. And they asked for Barabbas, and Pilate really had no choice to release Barabbas, and he did release Barabbas, and he had to keep Jesus here. And he went back one last time to Jesus and said, look, let's go over this again. Where are you from? What are you doing? And Jesus really didn't say anything other than, my kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate's recorded as saying something about truth. What is truth? And he's just so frustrated, and he goes back out, and the crowd has really sharpened their argument, and they said, look, Jesus has said he is king. He can't be king and Caesar be king. If this guy says he's king, he's rebelling against Caesar Tiberius. And if this gets back to Rome, dude, you're in big trouble. You have got to take care of this guy because he's claiming to be a threat to Rome. And Pilate uses that excuse as his out. Okay, this is really now treason, and treason is punishable by the death penalty. Okay, I'll tell you what, I'm going to let you take him. We'll take him. Y'all come around. We're going to crucify this guy, which is a horrible way to die. And Pilate is so frustrated because he really knows that Jesus is not guilty. He calls his servants, and he has a bowl, and they pour water over his hands, and he says, look, I'm washing myself of this whole thing. His guilt is going to be on y'all, not on me. Well, that became a huge issue later, and that somehow Jesus' death is the responsibility of the entire nation of Israel, and Rome wasn't really involved. Well, let me tell you, Rome was involved. Rome was the one who killed Jesus. Rome was the one represented by Pilate who said, take him. And the Roman soldiers nailed Jesus to the cross. So it's something that can't be denied. And everybody had plenty of guilt. Everybody had a lot of guilt. Everybody had massive guilt. But it happened. And they crucified Jesus. He took his cross. He had to carry part of his cross. Legend says he carried his cross. Apparently, maybe didn't carry the whole cross, maybe carried the crossbeam, who knows. But he was crucified around noon on Good Friday and was dead by 3 o'clock on Good Friday. His last words were, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. When he died, he was taken from the cross. He was put in a tomb. A guy named Joseph of Arimathea and another guy named Nicodemus helped get him off the cross. Joseph of Arimathea, a rich guy, had a tomb that hadn't been his own tomb. He's still alive, so he hadn't used it yet. And he let them put Jesus in his tomb. They rolled a rock over it. And on Easter Sunday, he was resurrected. Jesus was resurrected and proved himself to be God because of his resurrection. So that's the story. But the whole notion of how this came about from a legal perspective is fascinating, isn't it? And there's a lot of blame to go around on both the Sanhedrin side and the Roman side. And they got ultimately what they wanted. Jesus was killed. Nobody thought about a resurrection. Nobody heard of a resurrection. This is a whole new deal. Ultimately, we know what happened. And Christianity came about from it. And on Pentecost, which is 50 days later, the Holy Spirit came down on the apostles and everybody else that was gathered there, and that began the Christian church, which now has millions and billions of followers, me being one. So, the trial of Jesus Christ is a little-known story. I mean, we've heard it, we read the Bible, yeah, but to put it in a legal perspective, I think it's fascinating, and I do thank Chief Justice Joe R. Greenhill for doing the research, putting this whole 26-page presentation together, and hopefully you learned some stuff, and if you want to pass this on to help other people understand what happened. Thank you very much.